With the introduction of Legion's Mythic plus timewalking, Blizzard has made it possible for dungeons from previous expansion to also be timewalked into Mythic plus. Prior to Legion, there were 5 expansions for World of Warcraft. The Burning Crusade, which had 16 dungeons, Wrath of the Lich King with another 16, Cataclysm with 14, Mists of Pandaria with 9, and Warlords of Draenor with 8, in addition to the original 20 dungeons from Vanilla WoW. Which brings us to a little over 80 dungeons that do not have Mythic plus modes. And first, before we go over the list, let's mention what won't be mentioned in the list. Vanilla dungeons will not be here, since several have already been reworked once for the Cataclysm and Warlords of Draenor expansions. Many older dungeons are simply too long and too linear for Mythic plus timewalking, and dungeons with lengthy RP scenes or timed events will be excluded as well, as some of the RP is simply far too long. Additionally, dungeons that have long run-back times are also excluded. And at number 10, we have the Hellfire Ramparts. This Burning Crusade dungeon is located in the Hellfire Peninsula and sees players fighting the Burning Legion and their fel orcs defending an orc citadels and ramparts. The dungeon isn't too long by Burning Crusade standards and has some interesting bosses and trash mobs. For some reason, it's not in the Burning Crusade timewalking queue, and it's possible that Blizzard felt it was too short with only 3 bosses. However, each of these bosses are fairly unique with their abilities, like how Watchkeeper Gargulmar is infamous for his ads which heal him, or Vazrudin calling down his dragon mount Nazin to aid him when he hits low enough health, or Omor the Unscarred, a big scary Doomlord who can summon ads and gives debuffs to players. Other Mythic plus challenges in this dungeon include things like various trash mobs that have hunter mobs with stuns, which can be a real headache if not CC'd properly, or how the mobs can run in fear and aggro other groups, especially with tons of patrols, which can either lead to some huge AoE fun, or quickly result in a wipe. Besides that, the dungeon itself is pretty simple and linear with only one corridor and a flight of stairs, the only real branch being at the very end for the second and third boss, meaning if your group wipes and you have to run back, it won't be that bad. It's an enjoyable dungeon to do while leveling, and most players have pretty fond memories of this place as the first dungeon most people would find themselves in upon entering the Burning Crusade. And at number 9, we have the Stonecore. Located in Deepholm, this dungeon from Cataclysm has players racing to save the World Pillar from the Twilight Hammer cult. The dungeon has 4 bosses, each of which very unique in their appearance and abilities. And of course the dungeon contains a return of our favorite outlaw mage and warlock hybrid, Millhouse Manastorm, as the mini-boss, harassing you in various groups of trash mobs, eventually trying to cast impending doom before he is of course interrupted by Corboros, a giant crazed grey worm that burrows underground and can kill you instantly if he hits you while reappearing, which can happen randomly with the janky hitbox of this attack, all while summoning swarms of small worms and spewing shard barrages. Or Slabhide, who makes players hide behind stone spikes during one of his phases, while also avoiding lava pools, but is more well known for having a chance to drop a unique mount too. And anyone who has done this dungeon before should be familiar with running away from Ozrok's massive ground slam, spell reflect, and knockback, all while he yells his iconic line of, "Break yourselves upon my body, to feel the strength of the earth." And lastly, evading High Priestesses Azil's purple bubbles of death while kiting crowds of cultists through zones of death while trying not to die to her chokeslams and giant flying boulders. The main reason for this dungeon being solo on this list is that it can be incredibly tedious, since the dungeon itself is very long, and especially since it has some pretty hard-hitting mobs and mechanics that can straight up kill you, like watch guards who, if they see you, will run to alert groups of mobs and pull extra if not killed quickly. To kind of solve this problem, Blizzard did put in a teleporter, but the teleporter only brings you to the middle of the instance, and it's still a pretty long walk from there to the final boss. With how infamous the Stonecore is in Cataclysm timewalking for the length of the dungeon, the tons of wipes, especially in Ozrok, and the density of trash, this is the reason why it lands solo on this list at only the number 9 spot, but it still makes the list nonetheless because it would be a great Mythic Plus dungeon. And at number 8, we have the Steamvault. Another Burning Crusade dungeon, the Steamvault is located in Zangarmarsh and features players fighting against Naga on their way towards the Serpent Shrine Cavern raid and Lady Vosh. This dungeon would make a great addition to the Burning Crusade timewalking queue since the dungeon isn't too complicated in its design, while also having branching paths and avoidable packs, all while having interesting and unique fight mechanics for its time period. The layout is very straightforward, and after defeating the first 2 bosses and releasing some valves, the final boss room opens up. This dungeon has 3 bosses which are all very unique with special abilities and mechanics. For example, Steamrigger summons a ton of leopard gnomes who try to heal him while shrinking players. And for Calthresh's fight, you have to kill Naga distilleries to stop him from getting a strong buff while also being careful not to hit his spell reflect. Just like Hellfire Ramparts, the dungeon also has a ton of trash packs that are fairly close together, and these mobs can fear, meaning CC is a big deal. Steamvault's placement of trash packs, its cool aesthetic and bosses, and its simple design makes this an excellent choice for Mythic Plus. And at number 7, we have our first dungeon for Mist of Pandaria, Gate of the Setting Sun. This dungeon is located in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms and has players aiding the Shadow Pan and stopping a Mantid assault on the Vale's fortifications. Gate of the Setting Sun is one of the more unique dungeons due to its open world feel and players fighting back a literal insectoid army. Players first fight against Saboteur Capitalic and his swarms of bombs, which require you to run out way before they explode, followed by Striker Godok's aerial charges, where he flies across the platform dropping tons of fire, requiring players to avoid his flurry of flame. Next, players deal with Commander Rumok, who summons tons of ads and leaves acid pools all over the floor while cleaving in front of him. And finally, Rygon, a giant bug whose armor protects him from harm and must be torn off first by loading yourself into some cannons and firing yourself on top of him till he throws you off, or until you break his armor, allowing you to finally DPS him while trying to outrun the pursuing Goliath. These 4 bosses are unique and make the dungeon very memorable, but the reason this dungeon is kind of lower on this list is because there are some notable drawbacks of making this dungeon a Mythic Plus. First off, the dungeon itself is rather long, along with some annoying RP parts, such as the cannons used on Striker Godok's platform to shoot down the swarms of flying Mantid and the cutscene that happens as you light the pyre before the 3rd boss, or having to fall your way down to the courtyard for the final boss with Rygon, which will kill people who are not careful, or have a way to avoid the multiple jumping paths. But other than this, the dungeon is pretty cool and would definitely make a great addition, especially since it already has a time mode available due to the challenge mode system that was added in Mist of Pandaria. All dungeons released during and after Mists already have a system in place to convert them into Mythic Plus pretty easily. And at number 6, we have the Lost City of Tol'vir. This Cataclysm dungeon is located in Uldum, has players fighting off against the rogue Tol'vir clan controlled by an air elemental aligned with the Old Gods. This dungeon would make a great time-walking Mythic Plus dungeon because it's relatively compact and has some really great boss fights. The 4 boss fights can be quite difficult. Pair that with the fact that there's large trash packs all over the place, it makes for an interesting and deadly Mythic Plus. The bosses have many unique abilities, such as General Husam's Mines, High Prophet Barims making players kneel, then kicking them to a unique Shadow Realm of sorts, and Wind whipping players around without their control while fighting Siam. All of these could make this dungeon much more interesting if they were combined with Mythic Plus elements. This dungeon is towards the middle of this list because it can be a tad long sometimes, and one boss, Og, is off to the side of the map. But one big redeeming feature is that there is a shortcut to the final boss through wind vortexes once the first 3 bosses have been defeated, meaning wiping on the last boss won't really be a problem. Despite some minor issues, it's still a good dungeon complete with some solid bosses, and the Oasis and the Forbidden City aesthetic of the dungeon is the reason why it lands here. And at number 5, we have the Everbloom from the Warlords of Draenor expansion. In this dungeon, players face the infectious Evergrowth as it leads an assault on Stormwind. Located in Gorgon, the dungeon's layout is fairly linear with 4 required bosses and 1 additional optional boss. The 4 required bosses are Witherbark, the Ancient Protectors, Archmage Soul, and Yalnu, while the additional boss is a giant spooky spider named Zeratak. The bosses have tons of various abilities, ranging from the Ancient Protectors need to be taken down in a certain order, with multiple types of AoE damage, to Witherbark needing you to manage water orbs to prevent him from healing, and Archmage Soul requiring you to avoid various spells, and choose to interrupt her to keep her in the first phase, or let her complete the cast and go into the next phases. All of these would make for some nice additional challenges in Mythic Plus difficulty, and some of the trash packs in this dungeon even have interesting mechanics, much like the one-of-a-kind bosses. For example, the plant-infested orc monstrosities can stun and root players. The downside of the dungeon is not only how densely packed all the trash mobs are, making it much more difficult to skip mobs, but the trash in the dungeon was also quite powerful, such as the addled mages at the end of the dungeon who were infamous in their ability to wipe groups, because of the spore images they release when they die. And even more so with how easy it is to possibly wipe or just lose a lot of time if some of the boss mechanics aren't dealt with properly, like Witherbark's water orb, since he'll just keep healing. And at number 4, we have the Stormstout Brewery from Mist of Pandaria. This dungeon is located in the Valley of Four Winds and has players facing off against Hosen, Vermin, and Ale Elementals. A highlight of the dungeon are some of the neutral drunk ghosts and the brewer at the end. The layout of the dungeon is linear, and the whole dungeon has a playful feel to it, and it's nice to have a somewhat goofy dungeon from time to time. In this dungeon, the first boss sees players interrupt a Hosen party to ride on top of barrels of ale and drive them into Ukuk. After players become the new top Uker-Duker and initiate a dance party, they can then swing giant hammers around to defeat Vermin along the path leading to the second boss, Hoptolus. This dungeon makes it higher on this list because of the last boss, Yanzu, the Uncast, which can be very tricky with its many ads and bubble phases. Although the one downside, the last boss requires some RP and waiting time before it eventually spawns. Although since RP time is accounted for in a Mythic Plus timer, it's not actually a big deal, but usually players don't like any RP scenes in Mythic Plus dungeons. The dungeon's layout, interesting bosses, and unique mechanics is what makes this dungeon deserving of a high spot on this list. And at number 3, we have the End Time. This Cataclysm dungeon, located in the Caverns of Time in Tanaris, has players defeating Murozond, an old god corrupted version of Nozdormu, the dragon aspect of time. This dungeon is unique in its layout in several ways. First, the entire instance is traversed through portals, making for quick travel if wipes are to occur. Technically, the dungeon has 5 bosses, but players only see 3 per instance. The first boss fight can either be the Echo of Bane or the Echo of Sylvanas. The second boss fight can either be the Echo of Jaina or the Echo of Tyrande, and the last boss is always Murozond. Each boss has unique aesthetic visuals for their mini-zone of a corrupted Dragonshire. Tyrande is probably the most annoying boss, as you can only kill the ants while in the moonlight of Elune she calls forth, forcing you to slowly traverse around this massive spiral before finally being able to fight her. And Bane can be difficult if you had bad RNG on the platforms he destroys, but otherwise is way more simple than Tyrande, requiring only 1 trash pack to fight on your way to him. Sylvanas' minions of death and AoE can be a pain as well, because if you can't kill the ghoul fast enough, the entire group can be wiped, since no one can escape the trap. But it's not all bad, seeing as some mechanics are really easy to avoid, like Jaina's ice spikes that you can just move out of the way of. One of the major downsides to this dungeon is that there are some annoying RP bits, such as collecting stones to summon Jaina, and the aforementioned Tyrande spiral, leading to the Tyrande/Jaina being the longest combo with Bane Sylvanas being the shortest. This just wastes time, and it's often the case that it is even more of a pain to collect the stones than to fight Jaina herself, along with the RNG of what bosses you're going to actually be fighting, as some runs will simply be easier than others depending on who you fight. Overall, this dungeon has fascinating lore, solid bosses, and a very easy layout to follow, with its only downfall being the boss RNG, which could probably be fixed for Mythic Plus by having a weekly rotation, or just a set boss order that never changes. And at number 2, we have the Temple of the Jade Serpent. This Mista Pandaria dungeon, located in the Jade Forest, has 4 bosses and has battlers battling against the Shaw of Doubt. Every boss in this instance is incredibly well done and has interesting characterizations and abilities. Players first must face off against the corrupted Jinyu, the Wise Mari, and Lorewalker's stepson's animated library. However, which order they do them in is at their own choice. Once both are defeated, they must fight against Liu Flameheart, and finally a remnant of the old god Y'Shaarj, the Shaw of Doubt, which are all unique in their own way, with the final fight with the Shaw of Doubt even seeing players battling corrupted versions of themselves briefly in an ad phase. The dungeon is extremely compact and has direct access to the first 2 bosses, with opening gates that lead directly to the 3rd and 4th bosses once unlocked. So if you were to wipe to the last boss for whatever reason, the time needed to get back to it is very minimal. The dungeon does have some short RP bits which could be annoying to some, but usually nothing that overstays its welcome. But Wise Mari's constant summoning water elementals paired with its water spin phase, and Lorewalker's Stone Step stories also need some time for the bosses to work through their abilities in RP before becoming killable, which takes longer than the rest of the dungeon. However, the Temple of the Jade Serpent is a fast dungeon that can easily be completed and is overall perfect candidate for something that should be turned into a Mythic Plus timewalking dungeon. And at the number 1 spot, we have the Bloodmaul Slag Mines from Warlords of Draenor. Located in the Frostfire Ridge, this dungeon sees players battling into an underground slave labor mine and battling tyrannical ogres to free their captives. It makes this list for many of the other reasons mentioned before. It's relatively short and has some interesting fights out of the 4 bosses located here. And the first 2 bosses can be approached in any order, allowing for some flexibility with how the dungeon is run, but also the many different trash packs leading to these bosses will very easily fill the meter without the group having to go out of their way in order to gather mobs. With all of the bosses themselves having unique abilities, like Save Watcher Crushto summoning slaves to aid him, along with leaping around the room at random, Forge Master Gudon summoning 3 elementals to aid him during the encounter, basically fighting multiple bosses during this fight, or Roltal, who summons giant boomerang boulders on a wooden bridge that have to be avoided while running against his channel pushback Heatwave, which is a nightmare for classes who can't move and attack at the same time. The final boss of the dungeon is Gogrok, and what makes him different from the rest is he uses a magma and fire abilities, but to a much stronger and more lethal extent than the previous bosses, and fighting him can get insanely chaotic even for regular difficulties, as every time he casts Magma Eruption, a large patch of magma appears on the ground, and standing in it results in death very fast. And to make matters worse, it stays on the ground for the entire fight. Luckily, his other abilities aren't too bad other than giving himself a 15% DPS buff occasionally, and summoning an ad that moves across the room quickly to one of the blast furnaces, dealing almost lethal damage group-wide if it makes it. meaning it must be CC'd and killed quickly. But this is much more difficult when the entire room is covered in magma. The boss is a DPS race, as CCing the unstable slags and killing them all while maneuvering the patches of death on the ground can be quite hectic in the last bit of the fight, especially in a melee-heavy group. Overall, this dungeon setting, aesthetics, pathing freedom, and numerous fun and challenging bosses makes Bloodmaul Slag Mines a great dungeon to be converted into a Mythic Plus timewalking dungeon. And that's why it's #1 spot on this list, especially since Warlords of Draenor dungeons are also set up to already have a timed mode available, thanks to the challenge mode system. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other dungeons that should have been on this list over the ones mentioned? Do you know of a good way to convert the long vanilla dungeons into a Mythic Plus one? If so, I'd love to hear about that as well as ideas for future videos just like this one down in the comments. Just a quick little side, I launched a new Hearthstone channel recently, which has videos similar to this channel, i.e. scripted, highly edited top 10s. So if you're a fan of Hearthstone, you should check it out. Link will be in the video description and at the end of this video.